Hello, my dear adventurers. Welcome back to another evening of shared stories and adventures. Tonight, we're going to be digging deep under the earth, all the way down to the sleeping halls of stone, the ruined kingdom of Moria. Honestly, there are so many iconic moments from The Lord of the Rings, but for me, nothing defines fantasy quite like the moment the Fellowship enters those dark gates. That whole sequence, leading up to the final, fiery showdown between Gandalf and the Balrog, is just legendary. So, to start us off, we're going to do a deep lore dive into the history of Khazad-dûm and the dwarves who called it home. We'll look at the origins of the Balrogs, how they ended up in the deeps, and how it all ties together. After that, I'll be reading one of my favorite chapters from the Fellowship of the Ring where they choose the path through the mountains to escape Saruman's spies. And if you enjoy these tales and want to support our journey, consider subscribing to the channel and let me know where you are listening from. Now, it's about that time to curl up, get cozy with some dwarven ale, and get started with our adventure. Long before it was called Moria, it had a much grander name, Khazad-dûm. It was the crown jewel of dwarven craftsmanship and the very heart of their civilization. To the dwarves, it wasn't just a mine, it was home. But to understand how this grandeur turned to shadow, we have to go back, way back, to the beginning of dwarven history and talk about Durin the Deathless. Long before the pickaxes of the dwarves echoed through the deep, or the first spark of a forge illuminated the dark, there was only the silence of the world's beginning. To understand the majesty of the sleeping halls, we have to travel back to the very start of dwarven history and speak of Durin the Deathless. He was the first of the 7 dwarven fathers, a figure of such legend that his people believed his spirit never truly left them. Instead, they held that he was reincarnated in his descendants, the same soul returning time and again to lead his people through the ages. Durin first awoke at Mount Gundabad in the far north, standing alone as the progenitor of his race. From those cold, northern heights, he began a long journey southward, driven by a purpose he alone understood. He traveled until he found himself within a glen of shadows, cradled between 2 great arms of the mountains where 3 magnificent white peaks pierced the sky. It was here, nestled in the shadows of what we now call the Misty Mountains, that he discovered a quiet, still lake. As Durin leaned over the water's edge, he saw something that would change the fate of Middle-earth forever. The surface was so still and dark that it reflected the stars above perfectly, looking like a second sky captured in the earth. But in that reflection, a crown of 7 stars appeared to hover directly above Durin's head, even though the sun was shining in the world above. Taking this as a divine omen, Durin named the water Khalid's Aram, the Mirror, and identified the 3 peaks above as the Red Horn, the Silvertine, and Cloudy Head. He looked to the caves above the eastern shore of the lake and chose them as the earliest foothold for his new kingdom. This was the birth of Khazad-dûm. In the years that followed, his descendants would carve a great stone monolith, known as Durin's Stone, to mark the exact spot where the first father had looked into the water and seen his destiny written in the stars. This place became sacred, the foundation upon which the greatest of all dwarven mansions was built, long before it ever earned the darker name of Moria. Once Durin had claimed the caves above the Mirror, he set his people to a labor that would span generations, transforming the raw stone of the mountains into the grandest achievement of their race. They did not merely dig, they carved the very bones of the earth into the great underground halls of Khazad-dûm, which soon became the crown jewel of all dwarven craftsmanship. This was the heart of their entire civilization, and to the dwarves, these depths were never seen as a dark mine, but as a vibrant, eternal home. As their empire grew in size and grandeur, it earned its reputation as the greatest of all the mansions of the dwarves, a place where art and engineering became indistinguishable. The halls were a marvel of architectural beauty, filled with intricate stone carvings and fancy pillars that stretched toward the high, vaulted ceilings. Yet, beneath this beauty lay the strength of a fortress. Khazad-dûm was a stronghold of the highest order, featuring stone walls thicker than any castle keep and unyielding bridges that crossed over black, bottomless chasms where no sound ever echoed back. The dwarves constructed labyrinthine passages designed to confuse even the wisest of elves, ensuring that their home remained an impenetrable sanctuary. Day and night, the great halls sung with the rhythmic clang of forges as the dwarves worked their crafts in the heat of the deep fires. They were truly unstoppable in their ambition, descending further and further into the roots of the mountains to build vast treasuries and even deep dungeons. However, as they expanded their domain downward, they eventually reached the limits of their own understanding. Far below the lowest deeps of Khazad-dûm, they encountered primordial tunnels steeped in everlasting darkness. These depths were inhabited by nameless things, beings that had lived there since the earliest beginnings of the world. Though the dwarves continued to thrive in the upper levels, these mysterious, ancient entities remained a silent reminder of the shadows that lay beneath their magnificent stone empire. While the halls of Khazad-dûm were celebrated for their grand pillars and labyrinthine passages, the true reason for the kingdom's unmatched fame was not its architecture, but the unique treasure hidden within its bones. This was the discovery of mithril, an ore so rare and wondrous that the dwarves valued it above all other gems and metals. To the dwarves, it was the soul of their mountain, but the elves gave it a name that spoke of its ethereal beauty. They called it true silver. Mithril was unlike any material ever found in Middle-earth, possessing qualities that seemed almost magical. It was lighter than silk, yet stronger than the finest steel, and it possessed a brilliance that never tarnished or rusted. When the light touched it, the metal reflected a glow so pure it looked like moonlight had been trapped within the physical metal. The value of this true silver was so immense that it was said a single thread of mithril was worth more than an entire chest of gold, and a shirt of its mail could be more valuable than the ransom of a whole kingdom. Even the mightiest of kingdoms cannot sustain themselves in isolation, for a people needs trade, allies, and neighbors who do not wish them harm. This necessity led the dwarves of Khazad-dûm to enter into a remarkable partnership with the elves of a region, their closest neighbors to the west. For a rare moment in history, elves and dwarves set aside their natural distaste for one another to form a trading partnership that would define a golden age for both peoples. The elves of a region were driven by a deep need for the incomparable mithril and the superior craftsmanship of the dwarves, while in return, they offered the dwarves vast knowledge and powerful enchantments. This era of cooperation was best exemplified by the friendship between two master craftsmen, Narvi the dwarf and Celebrimbor of a region. Together, they collaborated to create the doors of Durin, a marvel of engineering and magic built directly into the rock face of the Misty Mountains. Narvi provided the physical structure, the intricate framework, and the complex mechanics of the gates, while Celebrimbor wove the magic into the very stone. When shut, these doors appeared as smooth, impenetrable stone, invisible to the naked eye with no hinges or seams to betray their presence. Under the soft light of the moon, the true beauty of their collaboration was revealed as elvish letters, written in Ithildan, would shimmer into view with a soft blue glow. The inscriptions "Speak Friend and Enter" served as a testament to the peaceful and cooperative relationship that once existed between the two races. It was a time when the way between their lands was open and safe, a period of shared wisdom where it seemed that nothing could ever go wrong. For a time, it seemed that the prosperity of Khazad-dûm and the beauty of a region would endure forever, but as the histories of Middle-earth so often remind us, even the brightest golden age can be eclipsed by a creeping shadow. Into this era of peace and partnership came a figure calling himself Anatar, the Lord of Gifts. He appeared as a bringer of wisdom, a fair and radiant teacher who claimed to be an emissary of the Vala, sent to aid the craftsmen of the world in making Middle-earth as beautiful as the undying lands of the West. You might know him better by another, far more terrible name, Sauron. Disguised in this graceful form, he befriended the elven smiths, whispering secrets of metallurgy and enchantment that they had never dreamed possible. With his guidance, the elves forged the rings of power, great artifacts intended to preserve and protect. However, when the truth was finally revealed and the elves realized that Anatar was the Dark Lord in disguise, it was already too late. Sauron unleashed his wrath upon a region, sacking the realm and killing the mastersmith Celebrimbor. The partnership between the two races, once symbolized by the open doors of Durin, was severed in an instant. Among the treasures Sauron seized were distributed were the 7 rings given to the dwarf lords, and while he had intended to bind them to his will as he did with the mortal men who became the Nazgul, he found the dwarves to be a far more difficult prey. They were made of sterner stuff, born of stone and fire, and their hearts could not be easily turned to invisible shadows. However, the rings still carried a peculiar and devastating corruption. Instead of turning the dwarves into wraiths, the magic amplified their natural traits to a dangerous degree. Their simple, honest ambition for craftsmanship was twisted into an insatiable, burning obsession for wealth. As the world outside fell into turmoil, the dwarves of Khazad-dûm responded to Sauron's rising tide of violence by slamming their great stone doors shut. No one was allowed in, and no one was allowed out. This isolation marked the true end of the Golden Age. While the dwarves still possessed their mountains of mithril and their impenetrable halls, the old spirit of trade and friendship had crumbled into dust. Behind those closed doors, under the growing influence of their rings, the dwarves became estranged from the elves and the rest of the world, their minds narrowing until they could see nothing but the glittering veins of what lay beneath their feet. Their love for the mountain was no longer a joy, it had become a fever, and that fever would eventually drive them to dig into places that should have remained undisturbed. Beneath the grand architecture of the upper halls and the glittering treasuries of the dwarven kings, there existed a world that even the bravest of Durin's folk feared to name. As the dwarves pushed their tunnels ever downward, fueled by the power of the rings and an insatiable hunger for mithril, they eventually broke through the crust of the known world and into the primordial deeps. These were the roots of the mountains, places where the rock was old beyond reckoning and the air was heavy with a cold, suffocating silence. Here, far below the lowest dungeons of Khazad-dûm, lay a network of tunnels that were not carved by any hand or tool, but were gnawed out of the living stone by things that had existed long before Sauron, and even before the first rising of the sun. These were the nameless things, the ancient and sightless dwellers of the absolute dark. Not much is known of their forms, for few who ever laid eyes upon them returned to the light of the upper world to tell the tale. Even Gandalf the Grey, who would later descend into these very depths during his struggle with the Balrog, spoke of them with a rare sense of dread. He described them as beings that gnaw at the world, older than the Dark Lord himself, and so far removed from the concerns of elves or men that they lacked even names in the tongues of the living. They were remnants of a chaotic era of creation, monsters of a Lovecraftian nature that lived in an everlasting darkness where no sound ever echoed back. The dwarves, in their feverish quest for true silver, often sensed the presence of these entities without ever seeing them. Miners would speak in hushed whispers of strange tremors that felt less like shifting rock and more like the movement of something massive and alive. They spoke of hollow, whistling winds that seemed to breathe from the floor of the world, and of the sudden, inexplicable vanishing of lanterns in the deep pits. It is a chilling thought to realize that while the dwarves were building their empire of stone and light, they were essentially living atop a hive of primordial horrors. One such creature, though not found in the deepest tunnels, provided a terrifying glimpse into what these nameless things might be like. The Watcher in the Water, that multi-tentacled monstrosity that guarded the west gate of Moria, was theorized by Gandalf to have crept out of these very deeps, driven upward by the rising shadow within the mountain. It serves as a grim reminder that the earth is not a solid, stagnant thing, but a place with layers of history and terror. For all their strength and skill, the dwarves were merely guests in the upper crust of a world that held far older and hungrier secrets beneath its skin. The shadows in the lower reaches of Khazad-dûm had always been thick, but as the Third Age progressed, they seemed to take on a weight of their own. Under the subtle, driving influence of the Ring of Power worn by King Durin VI, the dwarves' ambition had transformed into a singular, feverish focus. Their forges never cooled, and their pickaxes never rested, for the desire for mithril had become a hunger that no amount of treasure could sate. They pushed past the safety of the established veins, driving their shafts further into the roots of the Silvertine, deeper than any living being was ever meant to go. The end of the Golden Age did not come with a sudden crash or a dramatic explosion. Instead, it began with a series of unsettling omens that many chose to ignore in their pursuit of wealth. Miners began to whisper of strange tremors that didn't feel like the shifting of rock, but like the breathing of the mountain itself. Lanterns would flicker and die in the absence of any draft, and a cold, unnatural dread would often wash over the workers in the deepest pits. They dismissed these signs as superstition or the weariness of the long dark, but the truth was far more terrifying. In their greed, they were approaching a prison that had been sealed since the first age of the world. During the height of their mining operations, a final blow of the pickaxe pierced a wall of ancient, forgotten stone, and in doing so, the dwarves committed a fatal error. They did not find a new vein of true silver. Instead, they released a nightmare. From the abyss emerged a creature of shadow and flame, a Balrog of Morgoth that had fled the ruin of the North thousands of years prior. This was a demon of the ancient world, a corrupted Maya spirit that had lain dormant in the deepest foundations of the earth, hiding from the wrath of the Vala. Now, disturbed from its ends of slumber by the clatter of dwarven greed, it was awake, and its malice was undimmed by the passage of time. The encounter was swift and catastrophic. King Durin VI, the very leader whose drive had pushed them to these depths, was the first to fall before the creature that would come to be known as Durin's Bane. The dwarves, though a folk of iron will and stone-hard courage, found themselves utterly powerless against a foe of such primordial power. Their axes chipped against its hide of shadow, and their shields melted before its aura of fire. A year later, Durin's son, Nain-I, was also slain, and the realization finally sank into the hearts of the survivors. The heart of their civilization had been lost. The halls that once echoed with song and the rhythmic chime of hammers were now silent, save for the heavy, dragging footsteps of the demon in the dark. The dwarves were forced to flee their ancestral home, leaving behind their treasuries and their history, as Khazad-dûm was officially surrendered to the shadow and became the dreaded Moria, the Black Pit. For centuries, the once bustling halls of Khazad-dûm lay in a heavy, unnatural silence, broken only by the scurrying of orcs and the rhythmic, deep thrum of the mountain's dark inhabitant. The dwarves had never truly forgotten their home, and that longing eventually sparked a flame of hope in the heart of Balin, one of the companions of Bilbo Baggins. He led an expedition to reclaim the glory of his ancestors, and for a short time it seemed as though the light might return. They occupied the upper halls and even found the starlit Mirror again, but the shadow was too deep. The story of Balin's folk ended not in triumph, but in a desperate, final stand within the chamber of Mizarble. The book of their deeds was left to gather dust, a tragic record of a dream that died in the dark. Years later, the silence was disturbed again, this time by the arrival of the Fellowship of the Ring. They did not come for treasure or glory, but out of a desperate need to find a way through the mountains to escape the spies of Saruman and the bitter, magical snows of Caradhras. As they approached the west gate, the landscape felt hollow and drained of life, as if the land itself remembered the terror that had driven the dwarves away. Beside the dark, stagnant water of the pool that now blocked the path, they stood before the silent, stone doors of Narvi. In the fading light, the magical Ithildan on the doors remained hidden, appearing as nothing more than a smooth rock face. It was only when the moon broke through the clouds that the ancient elvish letters began to shimmer with that soft, spectral blue glow. The riddle Speak Friend and Enter stood as a haunting reminder of the golden age of partnership we discussed earlier, a time when an elf and a dwarf could build a gate of shared trust. Yet, as Gandalf struggled to find the password, a different kind of ancient secret stirred. The Watcher in the Water, perhaps one of those nameless things driven up from the primordial deeps, reached out with its pale tentacles to seize the ring-bearer. The Fellowship was forced into the mountain not as explorers, but as prey, slamming the doors shut behind them to escape the monster in the lake. As the sound of the falling stone echoed through the dark, they realized they were trapped in the belly of the world. The air was stale, smelling of ancient dust and a deep, lingering malice. They were standing at the threshold of the black pit, where the reflection of the stars in the mirror had long since been replaced by the watchful eyes of things that thrive in the absence of light. The Fellowship's journey through the dark reached its breaking point at the bridge of Khazad-dûm, a slender span of stone over a bottomless chasm where the air grew thick with a heat that didn't belong in the cold heart of a mountain. Behind them, the drums in the deep beat a relentless rhythm of pursuit, but it was the creature that emerged from the shadows that truly froze their blood. It was a being of ancient malice, a figure of flame and shadow that seemed to swallow the light of Gandalf's staff. Durrance Bane had found them. As the others fled toward the eastern gate, Gandalf turned to face the demon alone upon the narrow bridge, a lone gray figure standing against a literal hell of fire. The confrontation was more than a mere clash of steel, it was a battle of spirits. Gandalf, a servant of the secret fire, wielded the flame of Aenir against the dark fire of Uden. With a final, thunderous strike of his staff, the bridge shattered beneath the Balrog's feet. But as the demon plummeted into the abyss, its whip of fire lashed out, snaring the wizard's knees and dragging him down into the darkness. To the Fellowship, it appeared to be the end, a tragic sacrifice that left them leaderless and broken on the threshold of the light. Yet, the struggle was far from over. Gandalf and the Balrog fell for what felt like an eternity, tumbling through the black air until they plunged into a swampy lake at the very foundations of the world. Gandalf later described the water as cold as the tide of death, a chill so profound it nearly froze his heart. In that lightless deep, the Balrog's fire was extinguished, leaving it a creature of slimy, suffocating shadow. It fled from the wizard, seeking escape through tunnels gnawed by the nameless things we spoke of earlier, places where no map exists and no light has ever reached. Gandalf pursued it relentlessly, for he knew that if the creature escaped, it would eventually return to haunt the world of men and elves once more. The chase led them to the endless stair, an impossibly tall stone spiral that the dwarves had carved from the lowest roots of Moria all the way to the highest peaks of the Misty Mountains. They climbed for days, the wizard and the demon, emerging finally into the blinding white light of the mountain summit upon the Silvertide. There, amidst the snow and the freezing winds, the final battle took place. The duel lasted 10 days in total, a storm of lightning and fire that scorched the mountain peak until, at last, Gandalf gathered his remaining strength and threw his enemy down to the rocks below. The Balrog was destroyed, but the victory came at a terrible cost. Gandalf's physical form succumbed to his wounds and the sheer exhaustion of the struggle, and his spirit passed out of thought and time. But his task was not yet finished. He was brought back to life and sent once more to the mortal lands, no longer the Grey, but Gandalf the White, clad in a power and authority he had not yet fully revealed. With the shadow of Durin's bane finally lifted from the halls of stone, a seed of hope was planted. Though it would take centuries, the dwarves would eventually return to reclaim Khazad-dûm, returning the crown jewel of their civilization to the light, just as Durin had dreamed at the beginning of the world. And so, as you drift off to sleep tonight, remember that even in the deepest shadows and the most forgotten halls of stone, there is a light that can never be extinguished. I still have a second story for you to fall asleep to. The Whispering Oak. Wrap yourself in your traveling cloak, keep your lantern dim, and let these timeless echoes guide you home. Our journey begins at the very heart of the wood, where the oldest memory lives. The story begins. Long ago, before the first maps were drawn and the stars were still young in the sky, there stood a great oak. Its roots reached down to the foundations of the mountains, and its leaves were tipped with the silver of 1,000 moons. In a nearby village, there lived a scribe named Elian. Elian was a man of many books, but his heart was heavy with the weight of things gone by. The golden embers of the campfire dance against the encroaching velvet of the twilight, casting long, flickering shadows that play among the roots of the ancient pines. Here, at the very edge of the world where the mapmaker's ink fades into the unknown, the air is thick with the scent of wood smoke, crushed needles, and the cold, clean promise of the coming stars. I invite you to lean back against the moss-softened trunk behind you and let the warmth of this hearth seep through your traveling cloak. The forest around us isn't silent, but rather filled with a living stillness, the rhythmic creak of branches swaying like the masts of great ships and the distant, silver trickle of a stream that remembers the first rains of creation. I adjust the wick of my old brass lantern, the flame casting a steady, amber glow that anchors us to this small circle of safety. Beyond the light, the old forest stretches into infinity, a sea of emerald and shadow that has watched kingdoms rise and fall like the seasons. This is a place where the trees do not merely grow, they listen. They hold the sighs of the wind and the secrets of the travelers who walked these paths centuries before us. Can you feel it? That subtle vibration beneath the earth, the slow heartbeat of the soil beneath the moss? It is a heavy, comforting pulse, reminding us that even in the deepest wild, we are never truly alone. The fire crackles, a sharp snap of cedar that sends a flurry of sparks spiraling toward the canopy like captive fireflies. In this half-light, the boundaries of the mundane begin to blur. The gnarled knots in the bark of the trees look like half-closed eyes, and the mist rolling in from the valley floor moves with the grace of a silent, prowling guardian. This is the realm of the eldritch peace, that rare and sacred quiet where the soul finally catches up to the body. Here, the stories don't start with once upon a time, they start with the breath you just took, a shared inhalation between you and the ancient wood. I reach out and stir the coals with a branch of rowan, watching the orange glow intensify. The heat is a gentle weight against your skin, a counterpoint to the brisk mountain air that nips at the tip of your nose. It is a time for the shedding of heavy thoughts and the setting down of burdens. The mountains we crossed to get here are now nothing more than jagged silhouettes against a deepening indigo sky, and the path behind us has been tucked away under a blanket of fallen leaves. There is only this circle of light, the soft hiss of the fire, and the stories waiting to be exhaled into the dark. Look closely into the center of the flame. It flickers with the same ancient energy that once guided the wanderers of the Black Forest and the heroes of the Shire. It is a light that promises shelter, a light that says you have traveled far enough for one day. The warden's lantern is lit, the campfire is fed, and the forest is ready to speak. Close your eyes now, or watch the embers fade to a deep, pulsing red, and let the first of the old whispers find you. The journey is no longer across the land, but into the deep, quiet spaces of the heart where the oldest trees grow. Stay here in this warmth, traveler. The night is vast, but the hearth is steady. Leaving the warmth of the warden's campfire, Elian the scribe stepped into the deep velvet of the wood, his boots treading softly upon a carpet of needles and silver-threaded moss. His tall, lean frame moved with a scholar's hesitation, the weight of his leather satchel pulling at his shoulder, filled with the vast emptiness of unused parchment. Above him, the canopy knit itself together so tightly that the stars were reduced to mere pinpricks of light, like distant diamonds caught in a fisherman's net. The air here was different, colder, yet vibrating with an ancient, resonant energy that made the rolling wood of his staff pulse with a low, rhythmic amber light. Elian was a man who lived in the margins of history, obsessed with the echoes of the past, and as he walked deeper toward the forest's heart, he felt the weight of every unwritten word he had ever failed to capture. The path began to narrow, winding through thickets of ferns that uncurled like the fronds of a sea spirit's dream. Elian could hear the woods breathing around him. It was not the sound of wind, but a collective sigh of 1,000 trunks, a low groan of timber stretching toward the infinite. He was searching for the center, the place where the maps of men ended and the memory of the earth began. Every shadow seemed to hold a story, and every rustle in the undergrowth felt like a phrase half-spoken. His deep flaw, that gnawing need to possess the past through his ink, made him stop every few paces, hand trembling toward his quill, yet he found that the forest's language was too fluid for the page. It was a language of scent and shadow, of damp stone and the metallic tang of oncoming mist. As he crossed a bridge of fallen birch, the light of his lantern caught something that made his heart falter. There, clinging to a gnarled root, was a single white leaf. It was devoid of all color, as if the very soul had been drained from its veins. This was the first sign of the creeping silence, the mystical fog that Elian had heard of in whispers, a void that did not just kill, but erased. The sight of it sharpened his resolve, pushing him through the thickening fog that began to coil around his ankles like white snakes. He hurried his pace, his green cloak fluttering behind him, the silver gray of his hair blending with the rising vapor. He wasn't just a scribe anymore, he was a man racing against the disappearance of wonder itself. Finally, the trees parted to reveal a clearing that seemed to exist outside of time. In the center stood the whispering oak, a titan of bark and limbs so vast that its upper branches seemed to support the very sky. Its trunk was a labyrinth of deep ridges and glowing sap, and as Elian approached, The silence here was so profound it was almost deafening. This tree held the memories of the world, the first rains, the migrations of forgotten birds, and the songs of the first people who walked under its boughs. Elian reached out a trembling hand, his fingers brushing the rough bark. He expected to hear the thunder of history, but instead he felt a soft, thrumming vibration that matched the beat of his own heart. The oak wasn't just a monument to the past, it was a living, breathing present. He sat at the base of the great tree, opening his satchel and spreading a sheet of parchment across his knees. The creeping silence was visible now at the edges of the clearing, a wall of featureless gray that moved with terrifying slow-motion grace, snuffing out the glow of the moss as it advanced. Elian dipped his quill, ready to record the final song of the forest before the fog took it all. But as the first drop of ink touched the page, the oak groaned, a sound of immense sorrow and immense patience. The tree didn't want to be recorded, it wanted to be heard. Elian looked at the blank paper and then at the encroaching mist, realizing that his obsession with capturing the past was the very thing keeping him from saving the world in front of him. The air grew heavy with the scent of ozone and ancient dust, and the scribe waited, his quill poised, as the first true whisper of the oak began to vibrate within his very bones. The clearing of the whispering oak fell behind as Elian continued his descent into the deeper veins of the wood, guided now by a light that did not come from his lantern. Above, the moon had reached its zenith, spilling a liquid, pearlescent glow through the gaps in the high canopy, turning the forest floor into a mosaic of silver and ink. The air grew impossibly still, the kind of silence that precedes a miracle, smelling of night-blooming jasmine and the cold, metallic breath of the stars. Elian moved with a newfound softness, his green cloak brushing against the high ferns as he approached the great glade of Blackwood, a place where legend claimed the boundaries between the earthly and the celestial were as thin as a moth's wing. At the edge of the glade, Elian paused, his breath hitching in his chest. In the center of the meadow, standing knee-deep in a mist that shimmered like crushed diamonds, was the silver elk. It was a creature of myth made manifest, its coat reflecting the moonlight with a brilliance that pained the eyes, and its antlers branching out like frozen lightning bolts of pure crystal. The elk did not graze, it stood as a sentinel of peace, its hooves resting upon a hidden spring that bubbled with water so clear it seemed to be made of liquid light. This was the fabled spring of eternal peace, the source from which all the forest's vitality flowed, and the elk was its silent, celestial shepherd. Elian felt the old, familiar urge to reach for his satchel, to capture the exact curve of the elk's neck or the way the starlight danced upon its brow. His fingers twitched toward his charcoal sticks, the scribe's instinct demanding he document this impossible beauty before it vanished. But as he reached for the leather strap, the elk turned its head. Its eyes were not the eyes of an animal, they were deep pools of swirling galaxies, ancient and infinitely kind. In that gaze, Elian felt the frantic ticking of his own mortal time slow to a crawl. The creature's presence sent a wave of profound tranquility through him, a psychic hum that whispered of things that do not need to be recorded to be real. The silver elk took a single, slow step toward him, its hooves making no sound upon the grass. As it moved, the creeping silence, that gray, hungry fog that had followed Elian from the oak, seemed to recoil at the glade's edge, unable to penetrate the sanctuary of light. Elian let his hand fall away from his bag. He realized then that to ride the elk was to distance himself from it, to turn a living divinity into a mere sequence of ink. For the first time in his long life of recording, he chose to simply be. He lowered his staff, letting the amber glow of the rowan wood dim, allowing himself to be swallowed by the silver radiance of the glade. For a timeless moment, the scribe and the celestial beast stood in a communion of silence. The elk lowered its crystalline antlers, nudging the surface of the spring, and as the water rippled, Elian heard a melody, not in his ears, but in the marrow of his bones. It was the sound of the forest dreaming, a song of growing things and the slow, patient peace of the earth. He felt the tension in his stooped shoulders dissolve, the weight of the past he had tried so hard to carry finally slipping away like water through fingers. The elk watched him, its breath a cool mist that smelled of winter apples and ancient grace, acknowledging the scribe's transition from a collector of shadows to a witness of light. When the elk eventually turned and vanished into the trees like a fading dream, the glade remained transformed. The spring continued to pulse with a soft, inner luminescence, and the grass beneath Elian's feet felt charged with a gentle electricity. He stood alone in the moonlight, his satchel still closed, his heart finally quiet. He had come looking for lost wisdom to write down, but he had found something far more precious, the ability to stand in the presence of the sublime without the need to possess it. The silver elk had left no tracks in the physical world, but it had carved a path of stillness through Elian's soul, a path that led deeper into the mysteries of the old forest, where the darkness was no longer something to be feared, but a cradle for the light. Leaving the silvered radiance of the glade behind, Elian found himself descending into a hollow where the air felt thick and humid, tasting of sweet nectar and ancient loam. Here, the ground was no longer firm earth but a cushioned expanse of emerald and gold, a living tapestry of mosses that swallowed the sound of his footsteps until he moved as silently as a ghost. This was the garden of the Moss Maiden, a place where the distinction between plant and spirit dissolved entirely. The trees here were draped in long, trailing beards of lichen that shimmered with a soft bioluminescence, and the stones were so heavily carpeted in greenery that they looked like sleeping beasts huddled in the shadows. In the center of this verdant sanctuary sat the Moss Maiden. She was a figure woven from the forest itself. Her hair was a cascading waterfall of ivy, and her skin held the texture of smooth, sun-warmed bark. She did not speak with words, for the air in her garden was too heavy with life for the clatter of human speech. Instead, she hummed a low, droning note that seemed to vibrate through the very soles of Elian's feet. As he approached, she reached out a slender hand and pressed it against a large, moss-covered boulder. Following her lead, Elian set aside his staff and knelt, placing his palms against the cool, damp surface of the stone. The world suddenly tilted. The scribe expected the cold indifference of granite, but instead he felt a slow, tectonic pulse. Through the maiden's touch, he began to perceive the language of the roots and stones, a vocabulary of centuries rather than seconds. It was a slow-motion symphony. He felt the patient thirst of the oaks reaching down toward deep, subterranean rivers and the silent, grinding wisdom of the rocks as they recorded the weight of the mountains above them. The maiden's hum acted as a key, unlocking the memories held in the mineral and the leaf. He saw the birth of the forest in a flash of green heat and felt the sorrow of the first winter. This was the knowledge he had spent a lifetime trying to trap in ink, yet here it was, flowing through his veins like sap. The Moss Maiden turned her gaze toward Elian's satchel, that heavy bag of empty parchment and dried ink. With a gentle, grounding smile, she picked up a small, smooth pebble from the garden floor and pressed it into his hand. It was an invitation to stop observing and start participating. As he held the stone, the creeping silence that lurked at the edges of his vision seemed to stall. The fog could not erase what was rooted so deeply in the earth. Elian realized that the final song he sought was not a melody to be written, but a harmony to be joined. The moss under his knees felt warmer now, and for a moment His own hands seemed to take on the greenish tint of the garden, his fingers interlacing with the delicate ferns as if he, too, were beginning to bloom. In this sacred hollow, the scribe finally learned the lesson of the roots, that to endure the winter, one must store the light within. He watched as the moss maiden leaned over a wounded sapling, her song rising in pitch until the bark began to knit itself back together, healed by the sheer intent of her melody. She was the forest healer, the one who mended the tears in the fabric of the wild. Elian understood then that his role as a scribe was not to be a cold recorder of death and decline, but a witness to the forest's infinite capacity for renewal. He didn't need his quilt to remember the feel of the stone's heartbeat or the scent of the maiden's ivy hair. These things were now written in the marrow of his bones, part of a living story that required no paper to survive. When he finally stood to leave, the garden seemed to exhale a cloud of golden spores that lit his way, a parting gift from the Lady of the Moss to the man who was finally learning to listen. Leaving the lush, humid cradle of the Moss Maiden's garden, Elian began the arduous ascent toward the jagged spine of the world. The ground beneath his boots turned from yielding emerald to unforgiving slate, and the air grew thin and sharp, carrying the biting chill of the high peaks. This was the domain of the Brocken, a mountain shrouded in more than just snow. It was wrapped in a veil of ancient superstition and the restless energy of the spirits that call the heights their home. As Elian climbed, the trees stunted and twisted, their limbs reaching out like skeletal hands, until at last they gave way to a desolate, windswept plateau. Here, the sky felt dangerously close, a swirling vortex of bruised purples and deep indigos, and the silence was no longer the comforting hush of the forest floor, but a predatory, hollow ringing. A sudden, thick bank of mist rolled over the summit, transforming the landscape into a featureless white void. Elian slowed his pace, his rowan staff pulsing with a frantic, stuttering light as if sensing an intruder in the air. This was not the natural fog of the mountains, but the shadow of the Brocken, the heart of the creeping silence he had seen stalking the lower glades. Within the mist, shapes began to form, towering and distorted. Elian looked up and gasped as he saw a giant standing before him, a colossus made of vapor and shadow, its head lost in the swirling clouds. Every time Elian moved, the giant moved with him, mimicking his gestures with a terrifying, rhythmic delay. It was a phantom of his own making, a reflection of his fears and his heavy, unhealed past magnified 1,000 times against the screen of the clouds. The mountain spirit began to speak, not in words, but in an icy wind that whistled through the gaps in the rocks, echoing the scribe's own internal doubts. It whispered of the futility of his mission, of the billions of stories already lost to time, and of the arrogance of a man who thought he could save the world with a satchel of paper. The weight of the fog felt like physical pressure against his chest, threatening to crush the breath from his lungs. For a moment, Elian's resolve faltered. His knees touched the cold stone, and he felt the terrible urge to simply let go, to vanish into the gray and become another forgotten echo on the peak. The silence was hungry, and it was feeding on the very thing Elian had cherished most, his identity as a keeper of things gone by. But as the frost began to crust his eyelashes, Elian remembered the heartbeat of the stones in the Moss Maiden's garden and the celestial calm of the silver elk. He realized that the giant before him was only as powerful as the fear he gave it. He stood up, his legs trembling but firm, and instead of reaching for a charcoal stick to document the terror, he reached for the small, smooth pebble the maiden had given him. He held it tight, feeling its grounding warmth, a piece of the earth's core brought to the sky. He looked the towering phantom in its misty eyes and refused to look away. He didn't try to write it down or capture it. He simply acknowledged its presence as part of the mountain's wild, untamable spirit. As his fear dissipated, the shadow began to shrink. The towering giant dissolved back into simple moisture and light, revealing itself to be nothing more than an optical trick of the sun rising behind him, the famous Brocken specter. The mountain had tested his courage, demanding to know if he could face his own darkness without the shield of his scribe's tools. The mist began to break apart into long, trailing ribbons, revealing a view that stretched across the entire old forest, now bathed in the first pale gold of a high-altitude dawn. Elian stood on the summit, the wind whipping his green cloak around him, feeling a strange, soaring lightness. He had faced the shadow and found that it was hollow. The climb had been steep, and the air was cold, but the scribe's heart was now on fire with a clarity that no one could ever hope to replicate. Descending from the windswept heights of the Brocken, Elian followed a path that seemed to pull him into the very bowels of the forest, where the canopy grew so dense it created a second, perpetual night. This was the deepest thicket, a place where the sunlight of the day never reached the floor and the shadows were so thick they felt like velvet brushing against the skin. The air was heavy and still, smelling of damp earth and ancient, undisturbed resin. Here, even the amber glow of Elian's rowan staff seemed swallowed by the oppressive gloom, and the creeping silence began to press in again, not as a mist this time, but as a heavy, suffocating weight that dampened the sound of his own breathing. In the center of this sunless labyrinth, Elian stumbled upon a small, hollowed-out tree stump that radiated a soft, pulsing luminescence. Resting upon it was the star-glass lantern. It was a delicate thing, crafted from glass that looked as though it had been spun from frozen starlight, held together by fine silver filigree. Inside, there was no wick or oil, but a trapped fragment of a fallen star that shimmered with a rhythmic, breathing light. Legend spoke of this lantern as the only guide for those lost in the great forgetting. The darkest parts of the wood where one's own name and purpose could be stolen by the gloom. As Elian reached for the lantern, he felt a sharp, internal resistance. His scribe's mind whispered that he should merely sketch it, to document its location and its properties for his records, rather than taking it for himself. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the cold glass. He was still tempted by the safety of being an observer, a man who collected the light of others rather than carrying his own. But the darkness around him was deepening. The trees seemed to be leaning closer, their branches whispering doubts that made his head swim. The silence was no longer at his heels, it was inside his mind, trying to snuff out the memory of the silver elk and the moss maiden. With a sudden, decisive motion, Elian closed his fingers around the silver handle. The moment he lifted the star-glass lantern, the darkness did not just recede, it transformed. The beam of the lantern cut through the thicket with a piercing clarity, revealing that the menacing branches were actually laden with dormant blossoms, and the clutching roots were carved with ancient runes of protection. The light of the star-glass didn't change the forest, it changed how Elian saw it. It was a light of revelation, stripping away the distortions of fear and uncovering the hidden beauty that persisted even in the deepest shade. Holding the lantern high, Elian walked through the thicket with a steady, unfaltering stride. The star-glass seemed to respond to his heartbeat, glowing brighter as his courage returned. He realized that this was the true purpose of the scribe, not to merely record the shadows, but to be the one who carries the light into the places where others fear to go. The lantern's glow reflected in his rain-washed eyes, making the silver gray of his hair shimmer like the filigree of the glass. He was no longer just a man seeking wisdom, he was becoming a beacon within the story itself. As he emerged from the thicket into the softer shadows of the mid-woods, the lantern's light began to soften, settling into a steady, comforting hum. Elian did not put it in his satchel. He kept it in his hand, a tangible reminder that even when the world feels swallowed by a creeping void, there is always a fragment of starlight waiting to be found in the darkest hollow. The path ahead was still long, and the fog of the silence still lurked in the valleys, but the scribe now moved with the quiet confidence of a man who knew that the light he carried was more than enough to see him through the night. The star-glass lantern had shown him that the story wasn't just in the past he had tried to record, it was in the very light he chose to bring to the present. The path softened once more, leading Alien away from the jagged edges of the deep thicket and into a gentle valley where the air underwent a wondrous transformation. The sharp, ozonic chill of the high peaks and the damp, heavy scent of the sunless woods surrendered to something deeply nostalgic and profoundly terrestrial. It began as a faint drift on the breeze, a curling ribbon of scent that spoke of home, even to a man who had spent his life wandering the margins of other people's histories. It was the rich, earthy aroma of toasted barley, the sweet tang of sun-dried pipe wheat, and the unmistakable, golden warmth of bread baking in a stone oven. Following the scent, Alien crossed a small rise and found an impossible sight, a low-slung cottage nestled between the protective roots of two ancient, silver-bark beeches. The dwelling looked as though it had grown from the earth itself, with thick thatch that hummed with the drowsy vibration of evening bees and windows that glowed with a soft, buttery light. This was the hearth in the wilds, a sanctuary that felt as if it had been plucked from the gentle rolling hills of the Shire and transplanted into the heart of the German wild. It was a place where the epic scale of the forest's magic met the humble, grounding comfort of the fireside. As Alien approached the round wooden door, he felt the last remnants of the creeping silence wither away. The fog could not breathe here. It was stifled by the sheer density of the contentment that radiated from the cottage. He reached out and knocked, and before the sound had even faded, the door swung open to reveal a room that felt like a physical embrace. There was no grand wizard or forest spirit here, only the crackle of a well-tended fire and a heavy oak table spread with the simple bounties of the earth. The air was thick with the scent of dried herbs hanging from the rafters and the mellow, cherrywood smoke of a long-stemmed pipe resting in a ceramic dish. Alien sat by the fire, his tattered green cloak drying in the radiant heat, and for the first time in his journey, he felt the urge to put his satchel away entirely. He did not need to record the temperature of the hearth or the exact shade of the crust on the loaf of bread offered to him. The experience was too complete, too sensory to be reduced to the scratching of a quill. He watched the way the firelight danced across the stoneware mugs, realizing that this simple piece was the very thing that great legends fought to protect. All the battles of the high peaks and the mysteries of the deep glades were but a perimeter around this central truth, the sanctity of the home and the quiet joy of a shared meal. He took a bite of the warm bread, and it tasted of summer fields and golden grain, a flavor that seemed to anchor his wandering spirit back into his body. The final song he had been chasing began to change its shape in his mind. It wasn't just a high, ethereal melody or a grand historical chronicle. It was also the low whistle of a kettle and the rhythmic tapping of a pipe against a hearthstone. The scribe looked at his withered hands, no longer seeing them as mere tools for recording, but as hands that could hold a mug, stoke a fire, and offer comfort. In the warmth of the cottage, Alien understood that the forest's magic was not only found in the celestial and the strange, but in the enduring power of the ordinary. The hearth in the wilds was a reminder that even the most weary traveler needs a place where the whispers of the world are replaced by the steady heartbeat of the home. As he leaned back into the cushioned chair, the silver gray of his hair catching the fire's glow, Alien felt a deep, resonant sense of belonging. The great story of the wood was not just happening out there in the dark, it was happening right here, in the steam rising from a cup and the golden light reflecting in a weary man's eyes. He closed his eyes for a moment, not to sleep, but to savor the profound, earthy peace of a world that, despite its shadows, still knew how to keep the fire burning. Leaving the warmth of the cottage, Elian followed a sound that defied the logic of the mountain slopes, a liquid, melodic bubbling that seemed to be moving uphill. He found it beneath a canopy of weeping willows whose silver-tipped leaves brushed the water's surface like the fingers of a harpist. This was the stream that flowed backward, a ribbon of sapphire water that disregarded the pull of the earth, choosing instead to journey back toward its source at the summit. The air here was cool and carried the scent of wet stone and crushed mint, vibrating with a gentle, paradoxical energy. To look upon the stream was to feel a strange vertigo of the soul, as if the relentless forward march of the hours had suddenly been suspended. Elian knelt by the bank, his shadow stretching long and thin over the reverse ripples. For a man who had spent his life obsessed with the preservation of things gone by, the sight was both a wonder and a quiet terror. He had always viewed time as a predator, something that consumed beauty and left only dust in its wake, necessitating his desperate scribbling. But the stream told a different story. It whispered that the past was not a tomb, but a reservoir, a place where the water returns to be purified before it falls again. He reached for his satchel, intending to note the exact speed of the current and the way the light refracted against the upstream flow, but his hand stopped midair. The water didn't just flow backward, it carried reflections of things that had not yet happened and things that had long since passed, all swirled together in a shimmering, eternal present. He saw a flash of his own younger self, a boy chasing butterflies in a German meadow, and then a glimpse of an old man, perhaps himself, sitting peacefully under a golden tree. He realized that by trying to capture time, he was only ever holding onto its ghost. The final song he had been so desperate to record was not an ending at all, but a cycle. The stream was a lesson in letting go of the frantic need to document, to archive, and to possess. He leaned over and cupped his hands, dipping them into the cool, defying current. As he drank, he felt the chronological weight of his years dissolve. The urgency that had driven him through the deep thickets and over the high peaks began to feel like a heavy garment he no longer needed to wear. To let go of time was not to lose it, but to finally inhabit it. The stream whispered that the forest would always remember itself, whether or not it was written in a scribe's ledger. The moss would grow, the silver elk would roam, and the whispering oak would sing, regardless of the ink. Elian sat on the bank for what felt like a moment and an age all at once. He watched a single willow leaf fall into the water. Instead of being swept away toward the distant sea, it was carried gently back toward the heart of the forest, returning to the center. He smiled, a slow and genuine expression that smoothed the lines of his weary face. He had spent his life afraid of the end of the story, only to find that in the old forest, the end was merely a path back to the beginning. He stood up, leaving his charcoal sticks lying forgotten in the grass, and walked with a light, rhythmic step alongside the water, no longer a man chasing time, but a man finally walking in stride with it. The journey leads at last back to the great oak, but the world Elian returns to is no longer the one he left. The pale, hungry fog of the creeping silence has reached the very edge of the heartwood, standing like a wall of frosted glass, ready to shatter the last of the forest's color. But Elian does not tremble. He stands before the ancient tree, his tall frame illuminated by the dying pulse of the star-glass lantern and the soft, internal light of the memories he has gathered, not on paper, but in his soul. He looks at his satchel, once a heavy burden of empty promises, and with a slow, deliberate grace, he unbuckles the strap. He lets it fall into the silver moss, a discarded shell of a man who no longer needs to capture the world to be a part of it. As the first tendrils of the white mist touch the hem of his cloak, Elian closes his eyes and breathes. He draws in the scent of the Moss Maiden's garden, the warmth of the hearth, and the rhythmic song of the backward-flowing stream. He realizes that the final song is not a tragedy to be recorded, but a symphony to be conducted. Opening his mouth, he does not speak a history, he sings. It is a low, resonant melody that catches the vibration of the oak's roots and the silver elk's grace. It is his own heart voice, a bridge between the mortal and the eternal. As the song leaves his lips, the forest begins to wake in a way it hasn't for 1,000 years. A wave of golden light erupts from the center of the oak, rippling outward like a stone dropped into a still pond. Where the light touches the creeping silence, the gray void does not merely vanish, it transforms. The fog turns into a mist of glowing pollen, and the white, drained leaves flush with a vibrant, emerald fire. The trees begin to hum in unison with Elian, a collective awakening that turns the darkness of the deep thicket into a cathedral of shimmering gold. The scribe feels a profound transformation within himself. The silver gray of his hair begins to glow with the luster of the stars, and his feet feel as though they are taking root in the very heart of the world. He is no longer the recorder of the story, he has become the breath of the wood itself. The heavy tension of the quest dissolves into a deep, rhythmic peace. The forest is safe, not because its past was written down, but because its spirit was finally felt. The golden light begins to soften, mellowing into a warm, amber haze that feels like a heavy blanket being pulled over the shoulders of the world. The sounds of the woods, the rustle of the leaves, the distant call of the elk, the soft bubbling of the spring, all settle into a slow, hypnotic lullaby. Elian leans back against the trunk of the whispering oak, his work finished, his spirit finally at rest. As you sit here by the fading embers of our own campfire, feel that same golden peace settling over you. The old forest is dreaming now, and you are tucked safely within its embrace. The shadows are no longer a mystery to be solved, but a sanctuary where you can finally let go. The journey is over, the scribe has found his song, and the woods are whispering a final, gentle blessing. Let your breath match the slow sway of the ancient branches. Let the warmth of the hearth and the light of the stars carry you into the quiet places. The story is complete, the forest is awake, and it is time, at last, to sleep.